Okay, guys, we're starting in our Egyptian chapter this time. We are still in Content Area 2. Again, Content Area 2 covers at least 4 chapters. We are breaking this down into different dynasties or different kingdoms. The fun thing about Egyptian art is it does not change very much throughout the entire succession of the art movements. So what we're going to talk about are the pre-dynastic and early dynastic ages, which is between about 3500 and 2575 BCE. We've got the Old Kingdom, which comes after that, 2575 to 2134. Middle Kingdom, 2040 to 1640. Then we've got the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070. And then the first millennium between 1000 to 30 BCE. Sorry. So, one thing to note is that the pre-dynastic periods, these periods in the Egyptian timeline are occurring simultaneously with the Mesopotamian culture. So what you're looking at here is a map. Egypt was divided geographically into Upper, which is actually Lower Egypt. What they're talking about there is one's upstream from the Nile and one's downstream on the Nile. So Upper Egypt is the southernmost part of Egypt, but it is upstream part of the Nile Valley. That's why it's down lower. It's a narrow tract of grassland that very much encouraged hunting. And then we've got Lower Egypt, or actually northern, which is very rich of soil. It's at the Delta Nile. The Nile Delta Islands, and promoted agriculture and animal husbandry. So they really worked in that. As we're going through the ancient Egyptians, they very much, and most of you probably already know this, had elaborate funerary practices. And these practices in the early parts of it really began to, it led these ancient Egyptians to erect these huge temples, or not temples, but mortuary temples called mastabas. They were like rock pyramids that were cut off at the very top, and we'll look through those. So pre-dynastic, early dynastic, and the Old Kingdom kind of run together. A lot of places don't necessarily talk about pre-dynastic, but they couple that in with the Old Kingdom. So pre-dynasty was beginning, and the beginnings were very obscure because it was early forms of human civilization still. However, artifactual evidence was found on the banks of the Nile, which attests to forming early Egyptian civilizations. But again, prehistory, so we don't know a lot about them. This pre-dynastic or pre-dynasty era, predates writing. So what you're looking at here, we've got evidence of sophisticated civilization, which begins to appear again on the upper banks of the Nile, or the Lower Egypt. Paintings and sculptures. We've got historical examples of Egyptian art that they've been finding pretty much in these funerary practices. Ceremonial stones carved on both sides. We'll see that in the palette of King Narmer here in a second. And then as far as architecture, we're looking at mastabas and these like the stepped pyramid at Djoser. So this is the palette of King Narmer. It's slate, 21 inches high. One of the earliest historical artworks that is preserved. It is a transitional piece from prehistorical to historical. So this is showing pictorial image of documenting a story. We have the registers. If you look at that, registers or ground lines that we talked about in Mesopotamia. This palette of King Narmer was used to prepare eye makeup. The Egyptians wore eye makeup. So a lot of times you see black eyeliner around their eyes because it was very, very bright in Egypt. Obviously, the reflections off the sands and even in the more Nile regions, reflecting off the water. So they would use the black eyeliner in order to kind of reflect or like sunglasses. It would, instead of absorbing the sun, it would like make it bounce, or it would absorb it instead of reflecting into your eye. This is a relief sculpture which depicts King Narmer and uniting Upper and Lower Egypt. So before this, Egypt was separated. There were two different distinct areas, and King Narmer is the one who united those. We've got Hathor god as a cow with the woman's face depicted 4 times on the top register. So looking at the very top register, way up here, depicted as a cow with a woman's face, that is Hathor or Hathor god. The figures note that they're standing on this ground line. The registers are, again, the ground line. We have that hierarchy scale, again, that we talked about last chapter. We've got schematic lines delineate Narmer's muscle structure. So his forearms are veiny, his thigh muscles, you can see that, are represented by straight lines. We have half circles for the kneecaps, so we're getting that defined muscle. If you look at King Narmer up there. The palette was used, again, to prepare the eye makeup from the blinding sun. The palette was commemorative and ceremonial. So there again, you're looking at, excuse me, you're looking at the red crown of Lower Egypt. We've got the sandal bearer behind him. Then we've got the defeated army, so it's, again, commemorating that. At the very bottom, we've got Narmer as a bull trampling the enemy and attacking the city. We'll talk more about this palette whenever we go through our artifacts, because it is one of our artifacts. So we're going to keep going. Again, we'll talk more about that, but if you see the white crown of Upper Egypt here, we saw the red crown of Lower Egypt there. That's denoting that he did, he combined the two, or he united it. So what we're looking at here as far as architecture, we're going to look at mastabas, which we'll see them here in a second. It's a sloped pyramid with the top that looks like it's chopped off. There we go. We're going to go on. So this would be a mastaba. This is a restored view of the typical Egyptian mastaba tomb. So you have typically a hole in the top. You have an entrance for it. Mastaba is Arabic for bench. So it almost looks kind of like a raised bench. Trying to move on. There we go. So if you look here, this is a layout of a mastaba. So go ahead and look through here. 1 here is a chapel. Then we've got 2 is a false door. What that does is it tricks thieves coming in. 3, we've got a shaft into the burial chamber, because what they believed, this is the hole that comes out at the top that you see there. What they believed is that the spirits of the deceased would come back and visit through that hole. And typically in the burial chambers, they would leave, or in the chapel, they would leave food and gifts like that, and they would come back and eat and then go back to the afterlife. The Ka statue was found here. A Ka statue is believed to house the soul of the dead person. That's where they would come back and visit. So again, this is an aerial view of what it would look like. This is a frontal view of what it would look like. So again, we've got the burial chamber way down in here. The deceased would come in, visit. We've got the false door, shaft to the burial chamber. This is just another view. Ka would be a vocabulary word, by the by. Oops, sorry. Let me go back. The chapel, which had a false door through, again, that's what I said with the Ka entering. I keep hitting the microphone. Sorry, guys. There we go. All right. So this is an actual image of the stepped pyramid complex at Djoser. So you see those mastabas. That is still a mastaba. It's a stepped pyramid. It's the very beginning forms of the pyramids that we see. Trying to turn. There we go. So Imhotep, if you guys have ever watched the movie The Mummy, Imhotep was the architect of this. The pyramid is one of the oldest stone structures in Egypt and the first monumental royal tomb. Imhotep was an Egyptian architect, this was designed and executed by highly skilled craftsmen and artisans, not by slaves. That's a common misconception. Many of these Egyptian pyramids were not built by slaves, but by craftsmen. Imhotep, classified as the first known artist in history ever. He is the very first, before Leonardo da Vinci, any of them, very first known artist ever. Most great artists were priests, and most likely priests of Ptah, which is one of the, or Ptah, which is one of the gods. This is the god who created the world. This is the first complex of buildings constructed entirely out of stone. Remember, in Mesopotamia, we have mud brick. These are stone. It consists of 6 unequal steps, like giant staircases. It gives the impression of a huge staircase to heaven, and that's why they built them like this, and that's why they did the pyramids like that, is because it was a direct ascent into heaven. It appears like a stack of mastabas, one on top of the other. The burial is below ground, as in a mastaba. And the step pyramid is solid. It's very solid. Part of the complex is called a necropolis, which literally means, part of this complex is called a necropolis, which literally means city of the dead. So it's a large burial area. Lots of burial there. Here's some more pictures of Djoser. All the information is on the slide. You guys can read through that. Okay, we're going to talk about engaged columns here. This is definitely a vocabulary word. So engaged columns are columns which, they're columns that are a translation into the stone of structural forms previously made out of plants. That's not what this is, but if you look at this, it looks like it has papyrus. This area was rich in papyrus, and it looks like indentions are like they've stoned over papyrus. These posts very much influenced the Greek columns later. Okay. So we're going into the Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom art shows as an unyielding stance and formidable expression. So this would be this is New Kingdom, but we're talking about Giza. See Giza up there? Right there, we're in Lower Egypt. So the Great Pyramids of Giza. Each pyramid has an adjoining mortuary temple. It's a place of worship of a deceased king and the depository for food and objects offered to the dead monarch. So basically, again, they would enter through when they would come to visit, and they would eat the food, visit the living, yada, yada, yada. It's a huge pile of limestone and with a very minimal interior for the deceased. The pharaoh buried within the pyramid is buried within the pyramid, unlike the Djoser stepped palace or stepped mortuary temple of Djoser, because instead of being buried underneath, they were buried within the temple. And the pharaoh is buried under the building, but it's not as far down. You'll see in just a second. So we have slanted walls, which symbolize the rays of the sun. Pharaohs would climb these again. They would ascend to heaven to join Ra. This is considered one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world, and it was built for Menkaure, Khafre, and Khufu, which it's basically father, son, and grandson. So here's some more images of that. You can see an aerial view of what the pyramids look like. So the largest pyramid is Khufu, Khufu, or Khufu, however you want to say it. It measures about 775 feet squared. At its base, 13 acres. It's huge. So that's the biggest one in the middle. Over the years, it's lost about 33 feet of its original heights. The Egyptians always buried their dead on the west side of the Nile where the sun sets, because that would be a greater ascent for them into their afterlife. All right. So this is what the pyramid of Khufu at Giza looks like. So we've got the silhouette of the original facing stone. So again, it was even bigger. 2, these little guys here that they're thief tunnels. So thieves tunneled in. We've got 3, the entrance. 4, we come up to the Grand Gallery. 5, we've got the King's Chamber. 6, what they believe is the Queen's Chamber. Not quite sure. 7, we come down here to false tomb chamber. So again, they put this false chamber down here because thieves were used to the mastabas in the burial and the riches being underneath the ground. It is not. 9 are air shafts. And 8 is basically relieving blocks, making sure it's not too much pressure right there in the middle of the chamber. The Great Sphinx. Very generalized features. So we're seeing this as very stylized. It's not of a specific person as far as we know. Although some say it may be a portrait of Khafre, whose pyramid stands right behind the Great Sphinx. It's carved in situ, which basically means it was carved on site, was not moved, cannot be moved. So in situ means carved on site. That is a vocabulary word. From a huge rock, this is the symbol of the sun god. It's a body of a lion, head of a pharaoh or of a god. The Sphinx seems to protect the pyramids behind it, originally brightly painted to stand out in the desert. Cats are the royal animals in the ancient Egyptian families. Probably because they saved the grain supply for mice, and obviously that's livelihood, right, guys? The head of the Sphinx is badly mauled from just over the ages. The nose obviously is gone. The beard of the Sphinx is at the British Museum. So it's back to that, what we talk about. Does it belong to the Egyptian people, or does the beard belong to the British Museum because they found it and excavated it? So another side of the Great Sphinx. It's carved from a spur of rock. Khafre. So originally placed in the pharaoh's tomb. So most of these tombs were completely ransacked by thieves. However, Khafre, his tomb was not found until recent historians found it. This is the statue for Khafre. It is it's created for his Ka, or his spirit again, to go to. It's made out of diorite. If the mummy is destroyed, then the Ka goes into this, or they can bounce back and forth between the two. There's a video on the top. I highly recommend writing that down and watching it. So we're looking here at Khafre. He's got horse wings, which are, if you see right here at the lower left, the horse's wings are enveloping him. This is Old Kingdom. The Old Kingdom style is definitely much more rigid. It's carved out of a single piece of diorite, I believe. Yep. Because they had not figured out the issue of freestanding form yet. So it would be considered a very, very high relief. So you can almost even see the stone, the outline of the stone which it was carved out of. This is an Egyptian portrait. It was meant to proclaim them as royal entities and not natural people. So the pharaohs of old Egypt, or of all of Egypt, were not like the Mesopotamians where they were spokesmen for the gods. They were the gods. They were God. It was built, like I said, it was built with a large square of diorite, which you can tell the artist draws on the back. The artist draws on the front, back, and 2 sides. Then once he draws on there, the apprentices go in and begin to chisel it away. The technique like this makes it look like a block, but with no negative space. So basically, again, a very high relief. So Menekar, and I can never say this word, you guys are going to understand them throughout, especially the Egyptian chapter. It's It's a little hard. So this is Greywalk limestone. What other artifact did we have that was made out of Greywalk? So Egyptian kings were divine beings, not mortal rulers, like I said. This is why the kings were always portrayed so muscular and so perfect in form. They were literally not that muscular, guys. I already said on the other side, the eagle, talking about the eagle, that shows that Khafre is a reincarnation or an incarnate of Horus. We've got locking lotus and papyrus plants at the base of the chair. Sorry, we were still on this one. So down here we see locking lotus plants at the base of the chair, which talks about united Egypt. Most of the Egyptian sculptures were painted, but most of them are left with the natural stone. So this is Minakar. So this is the grandson of Khufu. Frontally oriented subjects that depict Minakar and with his left foot out, but without a shift of weight of his hips. So this is a very unnatural stance. It's again carved from one piece of diorite, Greywalk. Most likely his wife, but some speculation that it might be the goddess Hathor, who he would have been her son. Khan says is tied to, Khan Academy says is tied to the queen and son, future pharaoh. So basically it is either the goddess, giving her son, or the mother presenting the future pharaoh. His wife is also assumes, so if this is possibly his wife, she also assumes the stance, rendered through the dress. So it's very, you don't see the legs, you don't see a lot of the form. He wears a kilt. It's called a Neem's headdress as well, and a false beard. They typically shaved their heads and wore false beards at this time. His hands are in fists with his thumbs facing forward. His wife has one hand upon his arm and the other around his waist. The polish on this piece was not finished. So it was, if you look at the top, you can definitely see that there's a lot more detail than at the bottom. I mean, the lady still has kinkles. So it's not a fully finished piece. He probably passed away before they were able to finish this. So the seated scribe. It was created for a tomb at Saqqara as a provision for the Ka. So basically, as we know, the Egyptians would bury what the pharaohs would need for the afterlife in with their pharaohs inside the tomb. So this is a seated scribe. It was created to help the Ka, or remember the Ka being the spirit of the pharaoh. It's extremely naturalistic. Now look at the difference between the seated scribe and Minakar or Minkara. Which one's more natural? You see rigid, strict muscles, can't move, guaranteed he didn't look like that. And then you have a little flabby tubby, some man boobs, and that kind of thing. The scribes or lower class people were seen in more realism versus idealistic. So the pharaohs were very idealistic. The scribes or the workers were not, because they were not gods. That's why. We're going to keep moving. Here's another one. Again, look at the tubby belly. Ka-upper. These are typically made out of wood. Same thing with seated scribe over here, painted wood. Ka-upper. Same idea. Okay. Sorry, I've lost my place now because I was going too fast. So what we're looking at here, there we go, is Ty. So this is a painted relief in a mastaba of Ty, who was a governmental official. He was not a pharaoh, but he was very high up in society. Ty's boat glides through the gigantic papyrus, which is symbolizing a rebirth. So he's hunting, which is a memorial to the deceased Ty. That's what he did. He liked to hunt. destroyed animals like hippos, who were pests and damaged crops, and were considered agents of darkness. So he's down there. If you see at the very bottom register, hippos, they've all got their sticks and weapons, and they're killing them, and he's traveling to the afterlife. Up here we see beautiful birds in this relief. Ty is doubled in size, so that's a hierarchy of scale. And the boat symbolizes the journey to the afterlife. Pepe II. Pepe II came to throne when he was only 6 and lasted about 31 years. The Old Kingdom was declining before then, but his reign, it was already declining by then, but his reign, given to the power, sorry, that makes no sense, guys. Anyway, it was declining. He came in and kind of brought it out of a decline. He helped it into the decline. He married 2 sisters of high-ranking Egyptians, who then made him a vizier, and his sons became part of the royal succession. Took power away from the pharaoh. So these 2 sisters basically fought over him. It took a lot of power away from the pharaoh. And if you look at this, we've got man baby here sitting on mama's lap. So this was kind of the decline of the Old Kingdom, and we move into the new or Middle Kingdom. Not New Kingdom, Middle Kingdom. So what we're seeing in the Middle Kingdom, again, it doesn't shift a whole lot, but we've got works with more relaxed figures and expressional faces. So we're looking at changing times. Egyptians challenged the power of the weak kings of the 6th dynasty, so of the ending with Pepi II. So Egyptians are challenging that. For a century, Egypt was in very much unrest. In 2040, King Mentuhep II united everybody again under the single ruler. So it was in so much turmoil and chaos that he then reunited them. This started the Middle Kingdom, which lasted about 400 years. Senruset III, one of Mentuhotep's second successors, fought brutal campaign in Nubia, and to win people there and to win a lot of slaves from that area as well. With him in the Middle Kingdom came the same iconic muscular, would prefer perfect figures that were very idealistic. However, what we're seeing now is, if you look at the eyes, it's more of a wise, they're half closed, it's more wise, it's not quite as, which if we can go way back, that's way back there. So you look at the eyes in this one, they're more stern, rigid features. We're looking at softer features now, which are giving the impression of even a half smirk or smile of happier times. They're bringing us into happier times. It's a look of calm. We're going into Beni Hassan. So Beni Hassan, most characteristics of the Middle Kingdom are the rock-cut tombs within the sides of mountains. These replace the mastabas and the pyramids. We've got cliff walls that are hollowed out to reveal small burial chambers. So we went from mastabas in pre-dynastic, we went to pyramids in the Old Kingdom, and now in Middle Kingdom, we are looking at the cutout rock faces here. These are considered reserve columns. They are basically, a reserve column is a cutaway from the interior chamber to look like a column, but it really has no structural, it doesn't give any structural, it does not give any structural support. Whereas we have the engaged columns, which are butted up against the wall, kind of acting as buttresses, that do hold support. There's another wooden figure. Look at the stance. She still has no shifting of weight, but the paint is exquisite. Look at the face. Look at the body. She's gorgeous. Okay, we're going into the New Kingdom. So New Kingdom art, Hyksos from Syria took over Egypt and immersed themselves into the culture. So basically, Egypt was taken over, but nobody really would have known the difference because they just immersed themselves into it. Egyptian king Ahmose took back the kingdom over again, and Thebes became the capital once again. So in the new kingdom, architecture is dominated by grandiose temple complexes. So they're not cut out of rock faces. They're not big pyramids, but they're these huge temple complexes instead of just one. Some were mortuary temples, the grandest of which were built against the tunneled into a cliff. At Abu Simbel, colossal portraits of the pharaohs were carved at the entry. We've got other temples called pylon temples, which were built to honor one or more gods. Pylon temples were often enlarged by successive pharaohs and kind of grew to gigantic sizes. So the next pharaoh would come and make it even bigger. If the most impressive monuments of the Old Kingdom were the pyramids, those of the New Kingdom are the grandiose temples. They were built to honor the pharaohs and queens of old. So we're looking at a map here. We're going down into Upper Egypt more. We're at Thebes, right? King Hatshepsut. So King Hatshepsut was actually a woman. She was the main woman king of Egypt. She would not have been called a pharaoh, but a woman king. She married her stepbrother when she was only 12, and he died, and was then he died and was to be the regent of the throne, of the throne for her stepson. So Hatshepsut's stepson was supposed to be king or pharaoh, but he died. Which then Hatshepsut came to try to claim the throne, and she claimed that the god Amon had taken the form of her father and visited her mother, and she herself was the result of divine union, declaring that the god Amun-Ra had spoken to her, saying, "Welcome, my sweet daughter, my favorite, the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Hatshepsut. Thou art king, taking possession of the two lands." So by basically declaring this and having this vision, she was able to declare herself king. You see her wearing the pharaoh's hat. She was king for nearly 2 decades and expanded Egypt through trade and not war. Egypt was very prosperous during her time. But poor Hatshepsut had a pretty big downfall. Because she was a woman, so it did not end well for Hatshepsut. Oh my gosh, are you done? Seriously? Oh, there we go. Sorry, it sounded like it froze. Okay, I guess we're right. So this is the mortuary temple of Hatshepsut. It's 3 colonnade terraces and 2 ramps. It was at one point kind of an oasis, lots of green everywhere. It was beautiful. It visually coordinated with the natural settings around it. We've got long horizontal and verticals of the terraces, and they are repeated in the rock faces. So if we see these verticals here, they're repeated up here in the rock faces. This is considered to build into living rock. So the New Kingdom built into living rock. They mimicked what was around them. So we've got Hatshepsut sculptures. Her sculptures were portrayed as a male, with all of the markings of traditional Egyptian kings. So we see those everywhere. She's kneeling towards the god. She may have a slighter build, but she's still pretty masculine. A lot of these sculptures of her were destroyed. The kings that came after her and overthrew her, we don't even know where she's buried. It's crazy. They just kind of got rid of her. Okay, so in situ, again, this is the temple of Ramses II. It's the rock-cut tomb. Resembles a pylon temple. Statues of Ramesses on the facade carved in situ. Remember what that means. In place. The sun god placed over the entrance, so we see him in the middle. The royal family located between Ramses' legs, so you see them at the bottom between his legs. Sun enters in the center door of the tomb on Ramses' birthday, October 21st, lighting up his statue, which is deep within the interior. Interior sculptures of Ramses are carved in reserve and reach about 200 feet into the mountain. This had to actually be moved because of the weather and the changing of water pattern. It was becoming destroyed, so they had to actually move it. It's pretty crazy. So we've got in here as well, we've got engaged columns, or I'm sorry, reserved columns. Ramses was the largest and greatest war king. He constructed his tombs for his sons, and a great tomb complex in the Valley of the King. Well, he constructed this tomb for himself, and then his sons are all in the Valley of the Kings, which we'll talk about that, and you guys might be familiar with that with Tutankhamun. Okay. Still in the New Kingdom. Moving right along. This is the temple of Amun-Ra. Amun-Ra was the main god. We've got huge columns tightly packed together, emitting little light into the sanctuary. Sorry, we're going to move. There we go. Okay. So this is the plan of the temple. We've got capitals and we have colonnades here in the middle. Where did we see this style before? Can you guys remember Mesopotamia where that was at? Okay. So this is the temple plan. This is the temple of Amun-Ra. It is not there anymore, but that would be an image of what it looked like. Okay, we're going to talk about columns and capitals. In Egyptian culture and architecture, there are three types of capitals. We have the papyrus capital, the palm capital, and the lotus capital. It is very good to be able to denote between those three. This is the, it's a model of the hypostyle hall in the Temple of Amun-Ra. Where this is notable is it uses light, natural light coming through. So they have two different sizes or heights of pillars here or columns here. And then, oops, sorry. Hey, go back. Okay. And then the light comes through up here and is able to illuminate because they're able to build these big structures. The biggest issue is the lack of light that occurs. This type of structure is called a clerestory when you're allowing light to come up from two different levels. So we'll talk more about the hypostyle hall. Biggest thing to note is the clerestory. Here is the hypostyle hall now. Raises the roof. Here's some more pictures. Okay, we are also seeing, here's painting within Egypt. We're seeing the construction of what's called dry fresco or fresco secco. So fresco is basically painting on plaster. True fresco or bueno fresco would be painting on wet plaster. But this is painting on dry plaster. We've got the largest figure here in the middle. And this, he's going in to hunt all of these birds, and this is an afterlife painting. So if you look at the difference between the two, this is old, this is new. Okay, Akhenaten. So this is the only shift in stylistic change that we see. Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti shifted everything. Oops, I will have to finish this here in a little bit. You guys are ready? Okay, yeah, there we are. Hey, okay guys, sorry for the pause there. We're going to continue with King Akhenaten. So what we're looking at here is during the New Kingdom, there was a short but violent upheaval which occurred in Egyptian society and in Egyptian art. We see this shift happen. But like I said before, you don't often see, there's hardly any to a very slight change in art from the beginning of the Egyptian dynasties to the end. So, but here we see a radical shift in the religious focus to monotheism. So it goes from many gods to only one. The sun disk god, which is called Aten, Aton, was imposed by the pharaoh Akhenaten. See, Aten, Akhenaten, previously known as Imhotep. This was a very profound but very short-lived changes in Egyptian art. So what we're seeing here is more androgynous features. So symbols of the sun god in human or animal forms did not exist in this period at all, but we've seen this a lot previous to this. So the sun symbol replaced everything. In the sculpture and painting, the traditional rules of proportion were abandoned and more expressive intimacy replaced the earlier stiffness and formality. This is called the Amarna period. The capital moved from Thebes to El Amarna. Much of the shift in the temple of the gods were much of the stuff and the monuments to the gods were removed from all of the temples. After Akhenaten's death, his new city, Tel Amarna, was largely abandoned. Traditional religious beliefs and many of the older artistic conventions returned. So what we're seeing here is a very androgynous form, meaning androgyny, meaning you don't know if it's male or female. We have a narrow waist, protruding belly, curved hips, heavy lidded eyes, full lips, dreamy expression. For a long time, this was speculated. Hold on just a second. Let me pause. Okay, so again, we're seeing that narrow waist, that androgynous form, very full lips. For a long time, people speculated that the shift in art, because it was so drastic and so temporary, was due to the fact of alien invasion, which is pretty funny, but not true. The images become much more stylized. The idea is that one god, all are equal, so that's why we see this androgynous form. So this is Akhenaten and Nefertiti, his wife, with the children. Again, you can see why people thought that they were kind of alienish, because they definitely look like that. But again, it's not so much that as they're more stylized. Okay, Nefertiti here. This is the mother of Akhenaten's wife of Imhotep III, which was Akhenaten's dad. She was originally a work previous in this was originally a work previous in the Amarna period, but then it was covered back up after the Amarna period ended. So everything kind of shifted. She gets a pharaoh's cap, but we still see that there with the elongated neck and the eyes. Same thing with this one. This is Tai. Oh, I'm sorry. Vice versa. This is Nefertiti, which is the Amarna period. This one this is mother of Akhenaten. Oops, sorry guys. This is in the style of it was in the Amarna style, but then they've covered a lot of they've taken off, if you look up the top, they've taken off a lot of the sun dials and things like that symbolized the Akhenaten period. So, post-Amarna period. So, following the death of Akhenaten, the traditional cult and priesthoods of Amun-Ra were re-established, and all traces of the worship of Aten were eradicated. So, eventually, Egyptian art returned to its traditional conventions, but the changes introduced during the region of Akhenaten lingered for a long while, and can be dedicated in the fluid, curvilinear forms seen in the art and artifacts found in the tombs of Tutankhamun. So we kind of see that in Tutankhamun. So Tutankhamun was probably Akhenaten's son by a minor wife, so not by his head wife, not by Nefertiti, but that's where that connection kind of comes into play with. So we're going to talk about the Valley of the Kings. Sorry, I'm trying to find where I'm at in my notes, guys. Okay. Turn. And I'm running out of notes. So the Valley of the Kings after a while, they stopped doing the rock face tombs, and they basically put everybody in one area, the Valley of the Kings. It was in a valley, obviously, and they would position people and soldiers to watch over the valley, and you can tell by the single road that kind of comes through there, and you can see any thieves or anybody who comes through there. But the most famous person we know is King Tutankhamun. I'm not going to go into this a lot because, like Aaron said, you guys have had this since elementary school. So there is a video there. But we see the death mask, the gold death mask. This is the innermost coffin. It is a symbol and resembles the king after death. So, painted chest from within the tomb of Tutankhamun. Although Tutankhamun was probably considered too young to fight, his position as a king required that he be represented as a conqueror. So this wooden chest was put in there, and if you look at the symbols, it shows in the features right there a large fight and a large battle. So we're coming around to the first millennium BCE. Basically what happens here is Egypt was lost in a commanding hold. This was the beginning of the descent of Egypt. Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE came around and ended up sacking, which Alexander the Great was Greek, ended up coming around and sacking Egypt, and eventually the emperors of Rome replaced the pharaohs. This is the last judgment of Hunefer, and we're going to go into this more as well because it talks about, it's one of our artifacts, but basically this talks about the journey in the afterlife. So we have Hunefer here, or Hunefer, however you want to say it, and these are all the gods and everything, and he's making his journey to the afterlife, and anyway, we'll talk about this more whenever we go into a Watch This Khan Academy video. I apologize for the length of this and the disjointedness of it. I had to stop several times, so if you guys have any questions, remember this is just an overview, and we'll definitely go into more depth when we come. Thanks!